Acts chapter 27 as we're continuing our study on the life of Paul. Acts chapter 27. And I know you might be thinking, wow, last week we were in Acts chapter 26. You just blew right by 6 chapters. Yeah, we did. And I'll just summarize a little bit of that part of the story in a few moments. Recently, I heard a message by Stuart Briscoe. And Pastor Briscoe is one of my favorite preachers. He's been one of my favorite preachers for years. Sometimes when I want a little challenge or refreshment myself, I'll try to get one of his messages. Some of our younger people had a hard time believing I actually did this, but I actually figured out how to get a message off of YouTube online. And I listened to him preach a YouTube message. He was talking to the students at Wheaton in their chapel service back in 2014, and they asked him to speak on the topic, Youthful Life Lessons in Serving God. Now, Stuart is an older man, and he's from England. He renamed the message he gave to this, Lessons I Learned When I Was Your Age Hundreds of Years Ago. That was his title of his message. And basically it was just telling 3 events that happened early on in his young life that impacted him for the rest of his life. Lessons he learned. And the first one is what I'd like to repeat for you today and will be a recurring theme throughout our message. And that was when he was drafted. It was the Korean War was breaking out. There he was in England, and they were going to be in the war, so they invited him to participate. And he got the letter in the mail that he was being drafted. So he had a choice. He went and he joined the Royal Marines of the British Army. There was living at his house at the same time a retired captain of the Royal Artillery. He was not only a friend of the family, but lived with them in their home. His name was H.S. May. And upon hearing that Stuart had joined the Marines, H.S. May was also a dedicated Christian, and he said these words to Stuart. He said, of course, when you enter the Marines, the first thing you need to do is nail your colors to the mast. Nail your colors to the mast. Now, that's not an artillery term. That's a naval term. Nail your colors to the mast. So he reviewed to Stuart what that term meant. It was a common term among the sailors. Nail your colors to the mast. And here's what it meant. That when the ships would go out throughout the history of the British Navy, which was one of the greatest in the world at one time, they would always raise their colors, their flag. And they would want anybody who was within sight of them to be able to know that they were sailing under the authority of the king, that they were sailing under the authority of England. And so their colors were raised to the mast so that everyone would know whose authority they were under and who they were representing. But when they were about to engage in battle, oftentimes the captain would give another order. He would order a sailor to scurry up that mast with a hammer and nails and nail those colors to the mast. Because if you were defeated in battle, the tradition in the Navy is you bring your colors down and you hoist a white flag of surrender. And so by nailing your colors to the mast, that was the captain's way of saying to his sailors, we're entering a battle, but we have absolutely no intention of surrender. As a matter of fact, we will not surrender. We will not bring those colors down. Those colors have been nailed to the mast. And so he said to young Stuart, as he was getting ready to leave for the Marines, the first thing you need to do is nail your colors to the mast. Stuart said, well, how do I do that? Well, what do you mean by that amongst the other men I'm entering the Marines with? And the man, Captain May, said this. He said, what I mean by that is right away, first thing, you need to let them know whose you are and whom it is that you serve. You've got to let them know right away who you belong to. You've got to let them know who you will serve. And so Stuart said to him, well, how did you do that when you entered the artillery? He said, well, the first day we're all in the same barrack for a while, and there's about 30 or 40 beds together in there. The very first night, I made sure I knelt down by the side of my bed and spent a time in prayer, even though I knew they all would be watching. And that way they would know I was a Christian. And Stuart said, well, what happened when you did that? He said, well, I knelt down, and as I was praying, after a few moments of prayer, I began to feel boots hitting me. They were throwing their boots across the room at me. And Stuart said, well, what did you do? He said, well, I finished my time of prayer, and I took every single boot, and I polished it and cleaned it and returned it. And that was his witness. That was his testimony. That was his way of knowing, letting all those other artillerymen know that he was a Christian. He was nailing his colors to the mast. He was making it known and not surrendering. And so he asked Stuart, will you do something like that? Will you kneel down? Will you nail your colors to the mast? And Stuart promised him that he would. Now, you can listen online to Stuart. I mean, if I could find it, you could find it. You can listen to Stuart tell this himself, but he said on that first night he began to get nervous and apprehensive and saying, well, I know I'm going to have to face Captain May again, so I need to be able to tell him I knelt by my bed. But I'm not real sure I want to let all these guys know. And he felt himself waffling a bit, caught in between. And so here's what he said. He resolved within himself he'd do. He said, I will kneel down by my bed so that I can tell Captain May when I see him again that I did it, but I'm going to act like I'm looking for something under the bed. And so as he's acting like he's looking for something under the bed, he hears the footsteps of men coming closer to him, and then he hears them talking, and one of them says, well, what is he doing? Well, I think he's praying. Praying? Yes, I think he must be praying. Well, so now Stuart realizes they think I'm praying. Now what do I do? So he thought, well, I'll just kneel down here. And one of the fellows even said, praying, is God under the bed? Because they saw him acting like he was looking under the bed. And so he thought, well, I'm just gonna then assume the posture of prayer for a little bit. He was totally out of the whole spirit of prayer. And so he's just kind of thinking things toward God. And then after a period of time, he gets up and he sits on the edge of the bed. And there's this whole group of men just standing there. Were you praying? Yes, I was praying. And then another one quoted a Bible about the sparrows and the hairs on your head and God knowing the number. And someone else said, well, what is that you're saying? And the guy said, I don't know. I just went to church one time. That's the only Bible verse I ever heard. And Stuart Briscoe realized that in that room he represented just about all the Bible knowledge that there would be in that room for the time they were together. And these men had questions, and they were able to talk with him about Jesus Christ. And here it is. It ended up being a great opportunity, not only that night, but throughout his time with those men, of sharing the gospel, sharing about Jesus Christ. And he learned this life lesson. This is what he said to the students at Wheaton. He said, let it be known whose you are and whom you serve, and then live with the consequences. That was his life lesson. Well, I believe as we look at the Apostle Paul, we see a man who really did nail his colors to the mast, who was unashamed of letting everyone know that he belonged to Jesus Christ and that he was serving Jesus Christ, and he had no intention whatsoever of backing away from that, and he would simply let that be known and live with the consequences. I think that's a pretty good lesson for us all. Well, here we go. Last time we were together in the life of Paul, we saw that the Spirit was saying, stop going up to Jerusalem, yet he's determined to go to Jerusalem. He goes to Jerusalem immediately. When he's in Jerusalem, he's there for just a few days, and then there's an uproar in the temple as he's in the temple, fulfilling a vow with some other men, and they had taken a vow, and he went in there to pay for the vow that they had taken, and so there's this uproar, the people, and they want to rip him apart. The authorities come down and rescue him from the mob. And he gets an opportunity to give his story to the mob. And the chapters that we're skipping over basically is Paul appearing before one authority and another, the religious council, and he tells his story. And the two governors, he tells his testimony, and even King Agrippa. And in that process, he had appealed to Caesar. He said, I'm a Roman citizen, and I appeal to Caesar. I have a right for my case to be heard before Caesar. And that was his Roman right. And he did make that formal appeal at the end of all of their interviewing. At one point, they leave him in jail for 2 years. Just leave him there for 2 years. At the end of this time, the authorities conclude that he's done nothing worthy of any kind of punishment. He should have been set free, but they said because he appealed to Caesar, had he not appealed to Caesar, we could set him free, but he's appealed to Caesar, so to Caesar he will go. And so they find a ship, and they put a bunch of the prisoners on this ship. And the ship has been already contracted to hired out to carry grain to Rome and other goods and other cargo to Rome. And we pick up the story where they are in a terrible storm at sea. Previous to this, when they were trying to debate what to do, what schedule they would be on, Paul had warned them, this is not a good time to be sailing. We should just stay in this harbor. They didn't listen to him. But now there is a terrible storm. It's called in some of your translations a nor'easter. Some translations call it a Euroclydon. Some believe there were hurricane force winds, whatever it is a horrible storm. Well, let's pick up the story in verse 17 of chapter 27. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the citrus sands, they struck sail and so were driven. In other words, the wind was just taking them. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. Let me pause here. Some look at that and say, well, Paul is just playing the I've told you so. I don't want to tell you so, but I did tell you so. I don't really think that's what he's doing. What he's doing is he's saying, I told you not to start this voyage. I told you it would be better to stay in the harbor. Now he's reminding them that he told them that, but why? Not because he wants to be an I told you so, but because he wants them to listen to the next thing he's going to tell them. He wants to validate, hey, I was right once already, now listen to me this time. I think that's why he's doing what looks to be an I told you so. But he says, you should have listened to me or you wouldn't have incurred this disaster and loss. Listen to verse 22. Now I urge you to take heart. Remember, they're in the midst of a terrible storm. They have already worked to try and put cables around the ship. This storm is so fierce, they're afraid the storm will break the ship apart. And so they have placed, you'll read this earlier, they placed cables around the ship, trying to hold the ship together in this storm. So this is not just some casual meeting. They're in the midst of it. And he says, take heart. For there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. This is absolutely amazing. He says it was an angel of the God to whom he belongs and whom he serves that stood before him that very night before and told him a few things. Number one, there's not going to be any loss of life on this ship. You're going to get to Rome. The ship will be lost, but no life will be lost. And you will be run aground on some island. Now, God told him all that the night before. And so he's telling the captain, the other sailors, he's basically saying, you didn't listen to me before and I was right, so please listen to me now. This isn't just coming from me. This is coming from the God I belong to. This is coming from the God I serve. He's nailing his colors to the mast. He's letting them know he serves this God. He belongs to this God. And this God has spoken to him, and they ought to listen. That's what he's trying to do here. But notice how exactly and how precisely God is speaking. The ship will be lost, but not a single life on board this ship will be lost. And you will be run aground, you will be shipwrecked, so to speak, on some island. And that's all they're going to know. And Paul says, take heart. Take heart. You see, sometimes in the Scripture, Jesus calms the storm. Remember that? The disciples are in a boat, and the storm on the Sea of Galilee is such, they believe they're going to perish, and Jesus is just sleeping through it. And they say, don't you care that we perish? Well, he does care. He does care. He just doesn't panic. Do not confuse that the fact that the Lord doesn't panic, don't confuse that with he doesn't care. The fact that he doesn't get all bent out of shape like you and I get all bent out of shape doesn't mean that he doesn't care. He might be asleep in the boat, but he cares. He's not worried about the storm. And so, you know the gospel story. He calmed the storm. Well, sometimes he calms the storm. Other times he doesn't calm the storm, but at all times he wants to calm you. He wants to calm me. And so he says, take heart. Don't be afraid. When he was calming the storm for the disciples, he said, don't be afraid. And now here's Paul saying to these guys, don't be afraid, take heart. And literally in some of your translations do it this way. Be of good cheer. In other words, have a good spirit about you. Everything's falling apart, Paul. We're veteran, seasoned, salted sailors, and we're having to cable around the ship thinking it's going to fall apart. We're going to lose everything. We're going to die. What do you mean, take heart? You know, there are times, and I want to paint a picture here. There are times when God will allow you to lose absolutely everything that makes you feel secure. And you will do your best to hold it all together. And God will let you lose it anyway. Now that ship represented to the sailors everything that made them secure. Their tackle that gets thrown overboard, their anchors, everything about that ship. Before we started reading in verse 17, they had let down a boat so it could go around the ship, and they were wrapping the ship in these cables, trying to keep the ship from splitting apart. Why were they trying so hard? That was their security. They did not want that in which they placed their security to fall apart on them, and neither do we. What do you place your security in? What is it that makes you feel secure? What would you do if that which makes you feel secure is now in the midst of a storm? What would you do if that which makes you feel secure is ripped away from you? It is just destroyed right before your eyes. There are times that God will allow that to happen because He wants to be our security. He wants us to know there is a security that goes way beyond the security of the ship we've trusted in. And He has an ability that is much greater than our ability to wrap cables around things and try and hold it all together in our own ingenuity. You and I can face storms that seem to be absolutely devastating. And notice what it says about this storm in verse 20. Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we should be saved was finally given up. No hope at all, except one man. One man who belonged to God. One man who had nailed his colors to the mast. One man who had heard a word from God. And that one man who had heard a word from God was going to make a difference to all 276 people on that ship. We know from later on in the chapter there were 276 people on that ship. So here's what we want to talk about today. How do we survive the storm? And if there is such a thing, maybe there isn't. One of the great things about preaching is you get to make up words, you know. But maybe I have undertitled this message. The message is Surviving the Storm. That's the title. I want to talk about how to survive a storm, but it's undertitled. In other words, what we want to talk about goes way beyond that title. Because I believe God not only wants you to survive the storm, He wants you to prosper because of that storm. He wants you to advance because of that storm. He wants you to increase because of that storm. So it's more than just survival. So let's look at this undertitled message, how to survive the storm, surviving the storm. I want to give you 3 simple things. Remember, there's no deep truth here at all. It's just stuff we need to remember. But when the wind is blowing and it looks like our ship's about to be splintered apart, it's the simple things that'll keep you. It's the fundamental things that are so important, not the profound new thoughts. So 3 simple thoughts. Number 1, hold on to Him. How do you get through this storm? How do you get through this devastation? When there is no hope, how do you get through that? Hold on to Him. Notice what Paul said, there stood by me this night an angel of the God. Now, there was a way in Jewish thinking of equating God with the angel of the Lord. Sometimes when they say angel of the Lord, what they're really meaning is the Lord Himself was there in some form, in some appearance. And so I say, hold on to Him. Look at verse 23. It is assured to Paul that God's purpose will be fulfilled. Look at that, verse 23. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve. I need to apologize to Krista Brown, my English tutor. I'm not always getting the who and the whom's right as I'm talking, so please don't grade me on the grammar. You probably didn't know it either. When do you say who? When do you say whom? And so Paul says, there stood before me an angel of the God whom I belong, to whom I belong, and whom I serve. He's nailed his colors to the mast. But this messenger, this divine presence, has said to him, you're going to get to Rome. This ship might be destroyed, but you're going to get to Rome. You might not get to Rome the way you think you were going to get to Rome. You might take part of the journey swimming. You might take part of the journey hanging onto a broken piece of wood. But you're going to get to Rome. What is that telling me? God's purpose will be fulfilled. And I want to remind you, I want to encourage you. I want you even to say this within yourself right now. This storm that I am in is not greater than God's purpose for my life. This storm that I am now in is not greater than the God who's made that purpose, who's created me for that purpose. That purpose comes from God, and there is no storm I will ever face that can be greater than what God has purposed for my life. And we will not only get through this storm, we will not only see the purposes of God fulfilled despite this storm, it might even be we'll look back and say the purposes of God were fulfilled somewhat even through this storm. God's purposes will be fulfilled. We had a message not long ago from Psalm 57:2. I cry out to God Most High, who fulfills His purpose for me. When I feel like all I can do is hide in a cave till these troubles pass by, I cry out to God, who fulfills His purpose for me. The psalmist cried out to God in Psalm 138:8, the Lord will perfect that which concerns me. Your mighty power, O Lord, your mercy, O Lord, rather, is everlasting. Do not forsake the work of your hands. He's crying out, Lord, don't forsake the work of your hands. Fulfill that which concerns me. Right now, if you're going through a storm, I want you to understand something. That storm is not to be underestimated. That storm just might wipe out your ship. That storm just might cost you more than you know. But I'll tell you what it won't cost you. It will not cost you the purpose of God in your life. God's purpose is greater than your storm. And God's power to fulfill His purpose is greater than your storm. So learn how to hold on to Him. Well, we hold on to His promise. That's letter A. Hold on to His promise. Back in chapter 23, when there was upheaval in Jerusalem, and there he was in the barracks, and I know he at least felt alone. There might have been other soldiers around there guarding him. But there, the night that he would have been saved from that crowd tearing him apart, he says, the Lord Himself stood by me. The Lord Jesus stood by me. And He said, Paul, don't be afraid. Be of good cheer. Take courage in your heart. As you have testified of me here in Jerusalem, you must bear witness of me in Rome. In other words, I'm telling you, Paul, you will wind up in Rome. This crowd won't kill you. You will wind up in Rome. The authorities that are against you, the religious council that is against you, they're not going to take your life until you get to Rome. You will be in Rome. That's the promise. And now they're in a storm at sea. And now it looks like all hope is gone of being saved. But there stands by Paul that night an angel of the God to whom he belongs and whom he serves, and says, don't be afraid, Paul, take heart. You will stand before Caesar. You will get to Rome. God's purpose will be fulfilled. And you've got to hang on to that promise of whatever God has promised you. I think of Caleb. God, and by the way, what God promises you, some of us, is not what He's promised some of the rest of us. Here's Caleb. And God promised him an area. God promised him a terrain. It included a mountain. And 40 years later, 38 to 40 years later, Caleb is able to say, give me this mountain. God has promised it. He hung on to that promise for all those years. Hang on to the promise that God has given you. And God has spoken certain promises into our life. Some of them are written in His Word. Some of them are breathed into our very spirit in our intimate relationship with God. Solomon said in 1 Kings 8, 56 through 58, as he's dedicating that first temple, he said, according to all that He has promised, there has not failed one word of all His good promise. Not one word has failed. Of everything He promised, not one word. And there's Abraham, who against all hope still believed. Romans chapter 4. How did he believe? He counted God able and worthy of what he had said, and God had promised him, and he would hold on to that promise. As I was reading devotionally through the English Standard Version, and I note the version because it's different in other versions, but Psalm 119, 140 jumped out at me some time ago. I'll read it from that version, English Standard Version. Your promise is well tried, and your servant loves them. Your promises, Lord, they're well tried, and your servant loves them. Now, some say your promise is proven. Some say your promise is pure. Why do they translate it differently? Because it's from the Hebrew word tasaraf, which means to test something with fire, to put it in a refinery and have it come out as a pure metal. And here the psalmist is saying, your promise, God, your promise has been in the fire. Your promise has been tried, and I love it. Your promise has passed the test, and I love it. Well, God has given Paul a promise. You will get to Rome. Now that promise is being tested. Now that promise is being tried. Now that promise is in the furnace of God's affliction, and Paul still loves it. How about you? What has God promised you? What has God spoken into your life? You might be in the midst of a refining of that promise. You might be in the midst of a trial that is not only going to shake you to the core, but it's also putting the promise to the test. Will you still continue to love the promise? Will you still continue to hold on to what God has said? Maybe like Job, in Job 23, he said, I'm looking for God, and I can't find Him anywhere, but I know His Word. I esteem His Word more than my necessary food. I don't know what God's doing. I don't know why I'm in this trial. I don't know why I'm in this storm, but God has said something to me. And I'm going to hold on to what God has said. I'm going to love that promise while it's being tried, while it's being tested. Sometimes we get it in our mind that God gives us a promise and that just makes everything automatic and everything's going to be smooth and easy. No, God gives you a promise and then He gives you a trial to put that promise and your faith and character to a test. The things that endure are those things that always come through the fire. There is something that is more precious than gold, and it is not just your faith. It is the trying of your faith. It is your faith that has been tested by the fire or by the flood or by the storm or by the nor'easter or the Euroclydon. There is the testing of the promise, and that we must still love the promise though it is tested. We hold on to His presence also, letter B. We hold on to His promise, but we also need to learn how to hold on to His presence. There was a real presence with Paul that night. It wasn't just a concept. It wasn't just a thought. It wasn't just a memory. There was a real presence with him. He called it the angel of God, the God whom I serve, whom I belong to. When he was in Jerusalem, it wasn't just an apparition or a vision of Jesus. It was Jesus stood by me. There's a real presence we are to hang on to. 2 Timothy 4:17, those epic words, we'll look at them more next week. But 2 Timothy 4:17, he said, previous at my first offense, no man stood with me, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me. The Lord was there. I didn't have anybody else, but the Lord was there. There was a real presence there. The Lord was there. One of my favorite verses, and I've always emphasized the wrong portion of this verse. Jeremiah 20:11, the Lord is with me as a mighty warrior. Man, I love that as a mighty warrior part. As a mighty warrior. He's a mighty warrior. He's going to fight my battles. He's a mighty warrior. But the most significant part of that verse is He's with me. Doesn't matter if He's a mighty warrior and He's not with you. The Lord is with me as a mighty warrior. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. Isaiah 43:2, just like the mountains cannot be removed, my kindness will not be removed. Isaiah 54:10, to Jacob in Genesis 28:15, behold, I am with you, I will keep you, for I will not leave you until I've done what I have spoken to you. Wow. God said, I'm not going to let go of you until I've finished it. I'm not going to let go of you until I've done what I said I would do. Boy, that's sure true about Paul. Paul, you're going to get to Rome. Paul, I gave you that word. That's my word. You're going to get to Rome. And I know there's a storm, but this storm is not greater than my word. And I'm here to tell you, you'll get to Rome. I'm here to remind you of the word. But I'm standing with you. The Lord's presence is with us. And somehow, in the midst of our storm, we got to learn how to practice the presence of God, how to enjoy the presence of God, how to get into the presence of God experientially, for He's with us. Psalm 16:11 says, in the presence of the Lord there's fullness of joy, and at His right hand there are pleasures forevermore. So if the Lord is with us, we need to learn how to have joy, even in the midst of a storm. That's why He said, be of good cheer, men. Why could He say, be of good cheer? Why could He use that phrase that said, have a good spirit about you? Have a new courage about you. Be of good cheer. Don't be afraid. Why? Because there's a presence. There stood by me. There stood by me. There was a divine presence. Do you think when Paul was there in the belly of that ship, he's still in his chains, and the angel of God stood by him? Do you think Paul maybe had a little bit of happiness then? Do you think he felt a little surge of joy coming up, that there was a divine presence with him? But instead of moping around and worrying about how strong the wind is and that our ship is cracking apart and everything we look to for security might be taken away, why don't we start praising the Lord? Why don't we enter His gates with thanksgiving and into His courts with praise? Why don't we start focusing upon Him and somehow experiencing, even in our storm, the presence of the Lord? The presence of the Lord. That storm cannot take the presence of the Lord away from you. Nothing can separate you from the presence of our God, who is everywhere, especially with you. Even in the midst of a storm. And like Jehoshaphat prayed out to God, 2 Chronicles 20:12, he said he was surrounded by an enemy that was so overwhelming. He said, we have no power against them, and we do not know what to do. But our eyes are on you, Lord. Think of that. We have no power. We don't know what to do. But our eyes are on you, Lord. We need to affirm that God's presence is still there, that we have a presence to hang on to. That's why we can have joy in the midst of sorrow. That's why we can have peace in the midst of a storm, because there is a presence. And oh, how we need to experience that presence. There stood by me. That's a real experience. There stood by me. Well, we hold on, letter C, we hold on by believing. We hold on by believing. Every battle you'll ever be in is a battle for your faith. We hold on by believing. Paul said, I fought the good fight of faith. Every struggle, every battle is about believing. But look at verse 25 rather. Therefore, take heart, men. In other words, cheer up. They're losing everything. By the way, why do you think they hadn't eaten in many days? Were they fasting unto God? Even though it was this season, was it because it was the Day of Atonement? No, these are sailors. They're fasting because they're seasick. Now, I've not gotten to go on a lot of cruising and whatnot, but I remember I went on one short cruise with Lorraine. It was one of those 3-day cruises. And I said to Lorraine, she said, well, how do you like it so far? And I said, well, it's pretty interesting, you know. And I said, the one thing that really makes me curious, there are so many people on this ship that are trying to quit smoking. And she said, well, what do you mean they're trying to quit smoking? I said, well, they all have a little patch on their arm. And I thought it was one of those nicotine patches to help you quit smoking. It wasn't. It was a patch to help them not get seasick. That's why so many of them had it. They didn't want to get seasick. Well, if you can get seasick on a cruise that's a little bumpy, what do you think about being in this Euroclydon? What do you think about being in this nor'easter that they've lost all hope and they're being tossed back and forth? So they just didn't eat for a long time. And Paul says, therefore take heart, be of a good spirit, men. Be of a good spirit. Here they're seasick. They're in the midst of a storm, and he says, be of good spirit. Why can you be of good spirit? For I believe God. For I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. Why can you hang on in the midst of a storm? For I believe God. I believe God. We hold on by believing. That's why we can receive the admonition, fear not. Be of good courage. Be of good cheer. By believing. Lorraine and I have adopted a psalm for our psalm of the year. We think about it and read it every day. It's Psalm 27. And every day in my devotions, I make sure I read Psalm 27. And that's not the only thing we read or that I read, but I read Psalm 27 every day. It's my psalm for the year. And Psalm 27, verse 13, in the Old King James, has a few words in italics that your newer translations don't have. And I'll quote it to you out of the Old King James. It says, I would have fainted had I not believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wow. That's one to hang on to. The next verse says, wait on the Lord. Strengthen your heart. Be of good courage. Wait on the Lord. I would have fainted had I not believed. Believed what? Believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord, not just in heaven when this storm kills me. No, I believe I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. That's in my experience here now. I will see the goodness of the Lord. I would have fainted had I not believed that. And some of us are fainting because we're not believing that. We need to believe so that we can hold on to His promise. And yes, we need to believe so that we can hold on to Him. Get back to that promise God has given you. It is noted in Abraham Lincoln's Bible that they believe he read regularly. There was an unusual smudge mark at Psalm 34:4 that they believe was because his finger always pressed there over and over and over. Interesting. Where would there be smudge marks of a finger in your Bible? All that Abraham Lincoln had to go through, and the verse that had the smudge mark by it was this: I sought the Lord, and He heard me and delivered me from all my fears. What do you do when you're afraid? What do you do when your ship's about to break apart? What do you do? Where do you go? You go to the Lord. How do you find the Lord? You go to His promise. And you go to His presence. And you can only go there when you believe. For I believe God that it will be as He has told me. And it produces this kind of have good cheer. Jesus said in John 16:33, in the world you're going to have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. There in Acts 23, when Jesus stood before Paul, be of good cheer, as you've testified of me in Jerusalem, you'll bear witness of me in Rome. Hold on to Him. Hold on to His promise. Hold on to His presence. You hold on by believing. Roman numeral number 3. And by the way, you can take heart. You can be of good cheer. Each point gets a little shorter in time, all right? So you're going to make it okay today. But Roman numeral number 2. How do you survive the storm? How do you even prosper in the storm? How do you come out on the other side? Roman numeral number 2, let go of cargo. In all these verses that I've written out for you there, verse 18, verse 19, verse 29, verse 38, talks about letting go of something or casting away something. And I'm not a sailor, so I don't know exactly what the tackle consisted of. But look at verse 19. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. They're giving up on even being able to navigate this thing. There comes a point where you say, this storm is so strong, I don't even know. I'm going to have to give up the navigation of this. God, you're going to have to be in control. I'll just throw the tackle overboard. I'm giving up control. I can't do this anymore. You've got to let go of some things. How about you? Have you given up control, or are you still in control? And they threw the tackle overboard. They had to let go. Let go of your cargo. This ship was not primarily just for prisoners. They had precious cargo on there. Somebody was going to lose a lot of money if they threw that cargo overboard. But it's probably lost anyway. So with their own hands, they threw the tackle overboard. Later on, Paul is going to say, we haven't eaten in many days. We need to eat. We need to be strong. So eat something. And after they ate some, they threw all the grain overboard. They had to let go of some things. Some things that could have been of value. Why? Because the ship was setting too low in the water. It was too heavy in the water for the storm. It was too easy for the waves to come over the top of it. It needed to be lightened so it could get a little higher in the water. I believe oftentimes the purpose of our storm is there things we need to let go of. And yes, we know I got to let go of my fear. I got to let go of my sin. I got to let go of my anxiety. I got to let go of my pride. There's a lot of those kind of things I got to let go of. There's other good things you got to let go of. And only God can speak those things into our hearts, what they are. You got to let go of cargo. You got, and the Greek word in verse 19 and 29 is ripto. That's going to be significant in a moment. Ripto. And it simply means, ripto means a deliberate hurling or tossing away. And you do it with a sudden motion. Either you do it reflexively or you think about it, you battle with it, and you say, okay, I'll do it. And you let something go. Have you ever done that with something that God was trying to get you to let go of it? You wanted to hang on to it, you battled, and there's the rest of it, and you reach that point and say, okay, I'll let go of it. And there must be a casting away and a pushing away and a letting go of certain things. And if you want to study that word, there's more references in the study guide for you. But there's another Greek word from this word, ripto. It's epiripto. And the epi on the front of that word means upon. So it means to let go of, cast away upon. In other words, you're going to cast it away from you, but upon. And it's used of the donkey. In Luke 19:35, where they cast their garments on the donkey. They took their garments off of them and cast their garments upon the donkey. What a picture that is. What is it that you must take off of your shoulders and cast upon Jesus? Because epiripto, the only other time it's used is from Luke 19:35, the donkey, but 1 Peter 5:7, where it says, cast your care upon him. Because he cares for you. He's going to take care of you, but you've got to cast your care upon him. And to be able to cast your care means you've got to let go of it. I don't mean, now I'm not a fisherman, so some of you fishermen might correct me afterwards. It probably won't be worth your time because I don't think I'll ever be a fisherman. But we talk about casting. Well, what do you do when you cast? Aren't you always reeling it back in? Don't you cast it and then you reel it back in? And fly casting, you do it a little quicker, but you cast it and you bring it back in. And sometimes that's how we cast our burdens. We cast them to the Lord and then we bring them back in. But this Greek word means you let go of it. You take it off yourself and you hurl it from yourself. But epi means you have a target. You're casting it upon someone somewhere else. Something else. In this case, it's a someone. It's Jesus. Casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. What a picture this is of these men on the boat. And they're saying, well, if we're going to survive, we got to let go of some things. 1 Peter 5:7 is quoting Psalm 55:22, where David talked about the burden he felt from being betrayed by his best friend Ahithophel. He was going to cast that onto the Lord. And the Hebrew word shalach there, it means to throw out, to cause to go. The idea there is away from yourself. But the idea of the Greek word in 1 Peter 5 is where it's landing, where it's going upon him, upon God, upon Jesus who cares for you. There are things we must lay aside, every weight and sin that easily besets us. Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Part of the purpose of our storm is for us. Here's the blanks to fill in. But don't just worry about writing the word. Worry about the truth of this statement. Part of the purpose of our storm is so that we will learn to surrender and to trust. So why does God make me go through this storm? So that I'll surrender, so that I'll trust. Because it's so easy to trust in that ship. We can see the ship. It's much bigger than we are. And so many others have already sailed on this ship. It's already made so many successful voyages. It's so easy to trust in the ship. But the ship is about to be split apart. That which you have been trusting in is not going to survive. So you've got to learn to trust Him, to cast your care upon Him. And in order to do that, there are times where we just got to let go of stuff, even good stuff. We just say, okay, this is cargo. It's just along for the voyage. I've got to let go of it. Skip Heitzig told I thought, an insightful illustration. This was a real person. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand because you'd probably embarrass yourself. So I'm not going to ask you, how many of you are fans of wrestling, pro wrestling? How many of you have? You raise your hand. He's unashamedly a fan of pro wrestling. And do you really think it's real? But anyway, the pro wrestling. And there was a wrestler many years ago. His name is Yusuf. And Yusuf was called the Terrible Turk because he was from Turkey. And many years ago, by the prize he won, and you'll know that this is a long ago story, he came over to the States to fight in a championship wrestling match. And he won. But Yusuf always had, there was just something about it, he always wanted to be paid in gold coin. And the winnings from that championship, he was a world champ, and he won $5,000. And he wanted it all in gold coin. He had some other winnings with him, but he didn't trust anybody. And he always carried his gold coin and silver coin on money belts around his waist. And on his journey back over the ocean, the ship sank, and so did he. Why? He wouldn't let go of his money belt. He wouldn't take it off. He was strong. He thought he could swim with... No. What do you need to take off? What do you need to let go of? Maybe the storm has come to reveal that. What is that which seems so secure to you, but in reality is false security, because there are storms that could destroy it. There are storms that could break it. Our only true security is Him. So hold on to Him and be willing to let go of anything else that He touches you and says, let go of. Last point, number 3. Your being in the storm will help others be saved. Your being in the storm will help others be saved. Now, there are conditions. Notice what this divine presence said to Paul. He said, there will be no loss of life on this ship. The ship will be lost. So something terrible is going to happen. Something destructive is going to happen. Something that normally you would expect the loss of life to be involved, it's going to happen. But there will be no loss of life, only the ship. And we know from verse 37 that there were 276 people on that ship. Look at verse 22. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. And then verse 24. Do not be afraid, Paul, you must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Why was God saving them? Because of Paul. He's granted you all those who are sailing with you. And then look at verse 31. Then Paul said to the centurion, some of these guys are about to jump overboard. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. There was a condition. You can't just do whatever you want and be saved. This is the way God said it would be. You can't just jump off ship and be saved. You got to stay on the ship. But the ship is going to crash. I know, but you got to stay on the ship. That's just the instructions that Paul had received from the Lord. Why? It doesn't matter. It's just what God had said. And then look at verse 44. And the rest, some on board, so talking about some of them swimming, when they finally, the ship did smack up and is falling all to pieces, they finally start jumping off because now the ship is being destroyed. Some of them are swimming, and the rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. Why were they saved? Did they believe? God said, Paul, I'm granting them to you because they're with you. They're going to be saved. Other people were saved because he went through the storm. But that's not the end of it. They land on some island, and it turns out to be, in one translation, it's Malta. In other translations, it's a similar word. The island of Malta. And in Acts chapter 28, verses 1 through 10, it says, the natives of that island showed us kindness. Can you picture in your mind all these guys coming up on the beach at different times, and some of them swam, they got there by stroking. See, there's my English again. Some of them swam, I think it is. Some of them swam ashore. Some of them grabbed onto boards and floated ashore. But there they are on the beach. They've been through this ordeal. They've undoubtedly lost a lot of weight from not eating. And they've been in the water. They've been in the storm. They haven't shaved. Thankfully, they got a bath in the water. But there they are on the shore now. And maybe we're all here. But it says the natives came and showed them kindness. Now listen, you read Acts 28, and here's an amazing thing. It says, not only did they show us kindness, Paul says one in particular took us into their home, meaning him and those that were with him, not all 276 probably, but took us into their home and gave us all that we needed. Don't miss that part. You threw it all away, but you got it all that you needed back. You threw stuff overboard, but everything you needed was given to you some way later on. God will take care of you. And there Paul is warming himself by a fire. You know the story. And he's carried some sticks over to put on the fire. And there's a poisonous, venomous snake in those sticks. That's why you should always let somebody else go get the wood. And so he's carrying these sticks. And there's a poisonous snake in those sticks. And he's over the fire. And that snake jumps out of those sticks and latches onto his forearm and is just dangling there. And all of the natives, they say, he must be guilty. He survived the storm, the shipwreck, but a serpent now got him, a snake now got him. And they stood there watching to see if he'd swell up before he died and swell up and die. But it says he just shook it off. Didn't Jesus say, deadly things won't hurt you when you're going out in his name? Those statements are not meant so that you can go find snakes and handle them as an act of faith, quote unquote. No, he's just saying, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to protect you. And here's Paul. And here I'm going to stretch it. I hope you don't think this is too corny. But I do want you to learn this point. When you're going through something, there are always people who are watching to see if you can shake off what just bit you. There are always people who are observing if you can shake off what just bit you. Someone just said something terribly hurting to you. Can you shake it off? People will recognize, people will observe. Something so unfair has just leapt out of the unknown and latched onto you, and it's so unfair. Can you shake it off? Or are you going to let it just hang on there and put more of its venom in you? Or are you going to even keep it on there yourself? Or can you just shake it off? Other people are watching. And they were watching, and they thought Paul would swell up and die, but he didn't. He shook off the creature into the fire, and he suffered no harm. They were expecting him, verse 6 of 28, to swell up and fall down dead. But after some time, they saw that nothing had come to him, so they changed their mind and said, he's a god. But the story goes on. There was a leading citizen of that island that took him in, and that guy's dad was terribly sick, and Paul had then laid hands on this guy, and he got healed. So word spread, and people from all around the island started bringing their sick people to Paul, and he was healing them. There was a supernatural move of God's Spirit on that island, and because he was a prisoner and had to move on, we don't have any record of Paul getting to establish a church, but people had to have been coming to the knowledge and faith in Jesus when that stuff was going on. I know it doesn't directly say that, but I got to believe if people are being healed and Paul's there to share the good news, I got to believe somebody's getting saved. Why were they getting saved? They were getting saved because Paul went through a storm. Paul was always willing to give his testimony. Paul was always ready to tell his story. Whether it be before the religious leaders, whether it was before the governor Felix or Festus or King Agrippa, no matter, or the crowd that wanted to tear him in pieces, no matter who he was before, you read those chapters, he's always quick to be able to about talking about what happened on the Damascus Road and about the living Jesus who's transformed his life. He was always ready to share. You and I ought to always be ready to share. It won't always be clear sailing. Sometimes you'll have to swim. Sometimes you'll have to grab a board. It won't always be easy, but if you just keep on believing, you'll get there. I want to close with one other scripture. It's Romans chapter 8. Paul says these words, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are killed all the day long. We are counted as sheep for the slaughter, yet in all these things we're more than conquerors through him who loves us. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord." You might feel like it, but remember, nothing can separate you from his love. The storm that you're in right now, the battering of your ship, the blowing of that wind, the losing of all your cargo, that can't separate you from the love of God. So hang on to him and rejoice in his love. Hang on to his presence. Last point to fill on your outline. Number 4, maintain the attitude of a doulos. And a doulos is a servant. A doulos is a slave. You can read how we get that in Exodus 21. And Paul oftentimes started his letters, Paul, a doulos of Jesus Christ. Notice what he said. An angel of the God to whom I belong and to whom I serve stood by me. What was he doing? He was nailing his colors to the mast. He was saying, this is the authority I live under, and I will not surrender. He was letting it be known who he belonged to. And if you're in a trial right now, if you're in a storm right now, I want you to remind yourself who you belong to. As one preacher said, as an illustration, he heard a man cry out to God, "God, I belong to you, and your property is in danger." Your property is in danger. What was he saying? God, this is yours. You've got to do something. Can you honestly say that today? I'm God's property and I serve him. So this is his storm. He's my security. I'm going to hang on to him. I'm going to let go of what I have to let go of, and I'm going to believe that somehow God's going to use this to save others. Would you stand with me, please? Musicians, would you?